Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to Mildred's Mind. I'm welcoming you from my bedroom today on Thanksgiving Day, and I'm hoping you have the best Thanksgiving. Thank you for joining us on this special episode. This is a podcast where we study foreign policy decisions. This week, we will unpack critical moments in history to explore the interplay of leadership, psychology, and decision-making of important historical events. Today, we're analyzing the 2003 U.S. invasion of Iraq and attempting to explain why this happened. This event reshaped international relations and left a profound legacy on the global stage. But you may ask yourself, why did this happen? Or how? And that is my job today to try to get you to understand a little bit about how this came to be and why this decision was made. To understand this, we'll focus on the leadership of President George W. Bush, examining how his personal beliefs, cognitive biases, and leadership style contributed to this monumental decision. Additionally, we'll explore how factors at the individual, state, and systematic level not only drove the invasion, but also offered resistance to it. I will argue that President George W. Bush's decision to invade Iraq was deeply influenced by his cognitive and moral frameworks, particularly his belief in a divine mission to spread democracy and eliminate evil. Bush's worldview, rooted in American exceptionalism, a sense of duty, and a preference for primitive action, played a central role in shaping his approach to the perceived threat from Iraq. By examining Bush's psychology, I will show how personal convictions, biases, and the influence of close advisors culminated in a decision that went beyond strategic considerations, revealing the psychological underpinnings of a consequential event. The U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003 was a complex decision that involved a range of political, military, and psychological factors, with President George W. Bush's motivations and beliefs playing a significant role. Examining the invasion through the lens of Bush's psychology provides insight into how personal ideology, worldview, and perceived moral obligations can shape decisions and impact international relations and a whole country or two as a whole. Let's begin with President Bush's personal convictions. His personal convictions were shaped by his Christian faith and a belief in moral absolutism. According to James Pfiffner in President Bush and the Invasion of Iraq, Bush viewed the removal of Saddam Hussein as not just a strategic goal, but a moral obligation. His conviction was evident in his speeches, where he framed the conflict as a battle between good and evil. Bush's rhetoric reflected his belief in what he perceived as a divine mission to spread democracy and combat tyranny. As Stanley Renshaw notes in His Father's Shadow, Bush's psychological need to fulfill what he saw as his calling heavily influenced his foreign policy decision-making. This moral framing wasn't just a communication tool, but it was a deeply held belief that shaped his approach to Iraq. But moral conviction, unfortunately, alone doesn't explain everything. Let's talk about cognitive biases. One key bias at play was confirmation bias. Bush's tendency to interpret intelligence in ways that confirmed his existing beliefs about Saddam Hussein's threat. Paul Pillar, in his article Intelligence, Policy, and the War in Iraq, explains how intelligence was selectively interpreted to support the case of war. Despite contradictory evidence, the administration focused on reports that suggested Iraq possessed weapons of mass destruction. This bias wasn't just Bush's, it preempted his administration as well. In Plan of Attack by Bob Woodward provides a detailed account of how intelligence was used to justify preemptive action, even when skepticism existed within intelligence agencies. Bush's conviction in the righteousness of his mission may have clouded his ability to critically evaluate dissonant evidence. Another critical factor was Bush's belief in American exceptionalism. This idea, rooted in the notion that the U.S. has a unique role to lead and protect the world, was central to the Bush Doctrine, which emphasized preemptive action against perceived threats. Along with that, Tony Smith in America's Mission explains how this principle was deeply ingrained in Bush's worldview. The doctrine justified the invasion of Iraq as a proactive measure to safeguard the U.S.'s interests and promote global democracy. This belief that America had a moral and strategic obligation to act unilaterally, if necessary, was a driving force behind Bush's decision-making. Richard Haass, as seen in the Iraq invasion 10 years later, A Wrong War, states in his interview that the Council of Foreign Relations critiques this approach, arguing that it overstated the threat of Iraq and the threat that it posed and underestimated the risk of intervention. Yet for Bush, the doctrine provided a framework that aligned with his personal beliefs and moral outlook. Now let's discuss the role of groupthink. The decision-making process within Bush's administration often sidelined dissident voices. Valerie Hudson and Benjamin Day in Foreign Policy Analysis of 2019, as we studied in class, emphasizes how group dynamics can be suppressed by alternative viewpoints in high-pressure environments. Bush's inner circle, including figures like Vice President Cheney and Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld, shared his hawkish stance. Sidney Blumenthal in The Bush Wars describes how this consensus-driven atmosphere stifled debate and reinforced the push for war. The absence of robust debate within the administration, coupled with Bush's own determination, created a feedback loop that amplified his predispositions. This highlights the psychological dynamics of leadership and how they can influence monumental decisions, such as the 2003 Iraq invasion. To fully understand the invasion, we need to look beyond Bush and his administration to the interplay of individual, state, and systematic factors. Because as we learned in class, many good decisions, or even bad ones, that explain major decisions have multilateral and multifactorial reasonings. At the individual level, Bush's psychological makeup, moral convictions, and leadership style were instrumental, as we've discussed. But individuals outside the administration also played critical roles. Figures like Hans Blix, the head of the UN Monitoring, Verification, and Inspecting Commission, publicly challenged the U.S.'s claim about Iraq's weapons of mass destruction. Blix's reports highlighted the lack of conclusive evidence, creating international resistance to the invasion. At the state level, there were significant forces both for and against the invasion. The U.S. Congress authorized military action in 2002, with strong support influenced by the post-9/11 climate of fear. However, this support was not universal. Politicians like Senator Robert Byrd opposed the war, calling it, quote-unquote, a rush to war without justification. Globally, state actors also resisted. France and Germany, both members of the UN Security Council, led diplomatic efforts to prevent the invasion. Valerie Hudson and Benjamin Day's analysis of state-level foreign policy in Foreign Policy Analysis 2019 highlights how multilateral resistance delayed U.S.'s actions and exposed cracks in the international system's consensus. At the systematic level, the post-9/11 international order played a key role. The global war on terror created an environment where preemptive action seemed not only acceptable, but necessary. Bush's framing of Iraq as part of the quote-unquote axis of evil exploited systematic fears about terrorism and WMDs. As Elizabeth Saunders explains in her CFR podcast, as well as her Presidents and Foreign Policy, A Conversation with Elizabeth Saunders, which was a podcast led by the Council of Foreign Relations in 2016. She states, as I was saying, she explains in her CFR podcast that the systematic level also offered checks. The lack of a UN mandate for the invasion and global protests demonstrated the limits of unilateral action. Finally, let's consider Bush's public communications. His speeches often employed stark moral framing, portraying the invasion of a fight against evil and a necessary step to liberate the Iraqi people. Elizabeth Saunders discusses how leaders use rhetoric to justify policy decisions and rally support. This moral narrative resonated with the American public, aligning with the post-9/11 sense of vulnerability and purpose. However, as Haas points out, the framing also obscured the complexities and long-term consequences of intervention. Bush's psychological outlook not only shaped his decision-making, but also the way he communicated the invasion to the world. In conclusion, the 2003 invasion of Iraq wasn't driven solely by strategic considerations. It was profoundly influenced by the personal beliefs and psychological frameworks of President George W. Bush. At the same time, state and systematic factors shaped, enabled, and resisted this decision. From a sense of moral duty and cognitive biases to global diplomatic resistance, the Iraq War serves as a case study in the complexity of leadership and decision-making. As we have seen, the psychology of all leaders, but in this case, President Bush, impacted the turnout of the invasion of Iraq. In his own words, he has described himself as a president who handled conflict through war and physical retaliation, which in turn became evident when we talk about the invasion of Iraq and his response to 9/11. President George W. Bush's response to the September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks was swift and multifaceted, encompassing immediate crisis management, domestic security measures, and an aggressive foreign policy strategy aimed at combating global terrorism. In his September 20th, 2001 address to Congress, Bush articulated a strong stance, rallying allies to join a global coalition against terrorism. He made it clear that nations supporting terrorism would be treated as enemies. On October 7th of 2001, the U.S., along with allies, launched Operation Enduring Freedom to dismantle al-Qaeda and remove the Taliban regime in Afghanistan, which had harbored Osama bin Laden and other key figures. The operation marked the beginning of a prolonged military presence in Afghanistan. In his 2002 State of the Union address, Bush identified Iraq, Iran, and North Korea as in quote-unquote axis of evil, signaling a broader strategy to confront regimes that he believed posed threats to global security through terrorism or weapons of mass destruction. You may ask yourself what the attacks of 9/11 has to do, but this is mentioned because it is a common pattern in response to national security threats done by President Bush. Eventually, the Bush administration shifted focus to Iraq, citing the threat of weapons of mass destruction and connections to terrorism, which culminated in the 2003 invasion of Iraq. Understanding this interplay is crucial for future leaders, policymakers, and scholars. It reminds us of the importance of diverse perspectives, critical debate, and awareness of multi-level forces shaping global events. I hope that I've been able to teach you something about the 2003 invasion of Iraq and the U.S. decision to do so. When it comes to President George W. Bush, his psychology, his morals, his belief system, and his preemptive decision-making when it comes to war, and how that was also backed up with other events such as his reaction to 9/11 and previous attacks when it comes to security threats and the wellness of the U.S. and just how leaders and personal attributes can shape our history. But I just want to say thank you so much for joining me on this week's segment of Mildred's Mind. Thank you so much for joining me specifically on Thanksgiving. And I hope we all continue to learn together, not only history of the past, but as we know, history repeats itself, and we're able to learn patterns and identify and analyze how this affects not only our history, but also our present and our future. Thank you so much, and until next time, stay curious. Bye.